The elevator doors opened with a soft ding on the 42nd floor of the downtown office building. Robert Chen stepped out, adjusting his expensive tie as he walked toward his penthouse office. Tonight was important. Very important. He had invited 12 of the city's most powerful investors and board members to his monthly dinner meeting, and everything had to be perfect. Robert owned one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the state. At 38, he had built his business from nothing into a company worth millions. Tonight's dinner could secure the funding he needed to expand internationally. The stakes couldn't be higher. He pushed open the heavy glass doors to his office suite and immediately heard the sound of gentle movement in his private study. Through the doorway, he could see someone carefully dusting his prized chess collection. The woman moved with quiet efficiency, her back turned to him as she worked. Isabella Rodriguez had been cleaning this building for 3 years. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, she arrived at 6:30 sharp with her cart of supplies. She was thorough, reliable, and almost invisible to most of the executives who worked here. They rarely noticed her beyond a polite nod if they passed in the hallway. Robert glanced at his watch. 6:45. His guests would arrive in exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. Everything needed to be spotless, and Isabella always delivered. He watched her for a moment as she carefully lifted each chess piece, dusting underneath before placing it back in exactly the right position. She handled the expensive carved pieces with the same care she gave to everything else in his office. "Good evening, Isabella," Robert said, walking into the study. She turned and smiled politely. "Good evening, Mr. Chen. I'll be finished in here in just a few minutes. Take your time. I have a big dinner tonight, so I really appreciate you making everything look perfect." Isabella nodded and returned to her work. She had heard about these monthly dinners from other cleaning staff in the building. Important people came to discuss important business. She always made sure to finish this floor early on dinner nights so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Robert moved to his desk and began reviewing his presentation notes one final time. The numbers looked good. The projections were solid. But in business, numbers only told part of the story. Tonight was about relationships, confidence, and showing these investors that he was the kind of leader they wanted to trust with their money. At 7:15, the catering staff arrived with cart after cart of gourmet food. Robert supervised as they set up the long dining table in his conference room. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier. Silver cutlery gleamed against white tablecloths. Everything looked impressive, exactly as he had planned. Isabella finished in the study and moved to the main office area. She worked quietly, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces while the catering team bustled around the conference room. She had learned long ago to blend into the background during these busy times. The first guest arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. David Kim, a venture capitalist known for his sharp eye and even sharper business instincts. He shook Robert's hand firmly and immediately began discussing market trends. Within minutes, 3 more investors had arrived, followed quickly by the rest of the group. Robert felt the familiar surge of energy that came with these high-stakes meetings. These weren't just business dinners. They were performances, and he was always ready to play his part. He guided his guests through the office, pointing out awards on the walls and briefly explaining some of his company's recent achievements. "This is quite a setup you have here," commented Patricia Williams, a board member from one of the city's largest banks. She gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city lights below. "Success should be comfortable," Robert replied with a confident smile. "When you work hard, you should enjoy the rewards." The group moved toward the conference room for dinner, but David paused when he noticed the study off to the side. The chess set caught his attention immediately. The pieces were carved from black and white marble, each one a small work of art. "Now that's impressive," David said, walking over for a closer look. "These pieces look like they cost more than most people's cars." Robert felt a spark of pride. He had paid nearly $15,000 for that chess set, importing it from a master craftsman in Italy. "I've been collecting chess sets for years. This one is my favorite." Soon, half the group had gathered around the chessboard, admiring the craftsmanship. Robert began telling the story of how he had found the set during a business trip to Rome. As he spoke, he noticed Isabella quietly working in the corner of the study, carefully organizing some files on a bookshelf. "Do you play often?" asked another investor, running his finger along one of the marble knights. "Every chance I get," Robert said. "Chess teaches you everything you need to know about business. Strategy, patience, thinking 3 moves ahead of your competition. The conversation flowed naturally around the chess set for several more minutes. Robert enjoyed being the center of attention, sharing stories about famous games he had played and tournaments he had watched. His guests seemed genuinely interested, which was always a good sign for business. Then something occurred to Robert, an idea that seemed almost too perfect. He glanced over at Isabella, who was now dusting a nearby bookshelf, completely focused on her work. The wheels in his mind began turning. "You know what?" Robert said, his voice taking on a playful tone that made his guests look up with interest. "I have an idea for a little entertainment before dinner." He walked over to where Isabella was working. She looked up as he approached, slightly surprised to be addressed directly during one of his business meetings. "Isabella," Robert said, loud enough for his guests to hear, "would you like to play a quick game of chess with me?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Isabella blinked, clearly not expecting such an invitation. Around the chess set, the investors exchanged glances. Some smiled with amusement. Others looked slightly uncomfortable. I should probably finish my work, Mr. Chen," Isabella said quietly. "Come on," Robert said with a grin that was meant to be friendly, but came across as slightly condescending. "Just one quick game. It'll be fun." He turned back to his guests with a confidence that suggested he already knew how this would end. "What do you say, everyone? A little friendly competition before we eat?" The investors murmured their agreement, some chuckling softly. It seemed harmless enough, and Robert was clearly enjoying himself. They began to gather around the chessboard, drinks in hand, ready to watch what they assumed would be a brief and predictable game. Isabella looked around the room at all the faces watching her. She could have declined again. She could have simply said she needed to finish her work and leave. But something in Robert's tone, something in the way his guests were smiling, made her pause. "All right," she said simply. "One game." Robert clapped his hands together. "Excellent. This should be interesting." As Isabella set down her cleaning supplies and walked toward the chessboard, none of the people in that room had any idea that they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about assumptions, talent, and the people they passed by, every day without really seeing. Robert settled into the leather chair on one side of the chessboard, with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of a game before it began. He cracked his knuckles theatrically and grinned at his audience of investors, who had arranged themselves around the study with their wine glasses, clearly expecting to be entertained. Isabella took the seat across from him, her posture straight and calm. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the board with an expression that gave nothing away. The beautiful marble pieces sat between them like silent soldiers waiting for battle. "Now, Isabella," Robert began, his tone taking on the patient quality of a teacher addressing a student. "Have you ever played chess before?" "A little," she replied quietly. Robert nodded knowingly. "Well, don't worry if you're not familiar with all the rules. I'll help you along the way." He gestured toward the pieces with a flourish. "These are pawns. They can only move forward one square at a time. These tall pieces with the crosses are bishops. They move diagonally." As Robert continued his explanation, pointing to each piece and describing its basic movements, Isabella listened politely without interrupting. She nodded at appropriate moments and made small sounds of acknowledgement. The investors watched with amused smiles, some checking their phones while others made quiet small talk about business matters. "The queen is the most powerful piece," Robert continued, lifting the elegant marble queen and turning it in the light. "She can move in any direction as far as she wants. And this," he said, picking up the king, "is the most important piece. The whole game is about protecting your king while trying to capture your opponent's king." "I understand," Isabella said simply. "Excellent." Robert placed the pieces back in their starting positions. "Now in chess, white always moves first, and since I'm white tonight, I'll start us off." He paused and looked around at his guests. "Everyone ready for this?" David Kim chuckled from behind his wine glass. "This should be educational." Robert moved his king's pawn forward 2 squares, a classic opening move that he had used hundreds of times before. "This is called the king's pawn opening," he announced to the room. "It controls the center of the board right from the start. Very important in chess to control the center." Isabella studied the board for a moment, then moved her own king's pawn forward 2 squares to mirror Robert's move. It was a perfectly reasonable response, though she took longer to make it than Robert expected for such a simple move. "Good choice," Robert said approvingly. "You're learning already." He quickly moved his knight to f3, developing his pieces with the efficiency of someone who had played this opening countless times. Knights are tricky pieces. They're the only ones that can jump over other pieces, very useful for surprise attacks. The investors continued their side conversations while keeping one eye on the game. Patricia Williams was telling David Kim about a new restaurant downtown. Another investor was quietly checking stock prices on his phone. The game was proceeding exactly as everyone expected. Isabella moved her knight to c6, another standard developing move. Robert nodded approvingly and launched into another mini-lecture about piece development and controlling the center. With each move, he offered commentary not just to Isabella, but to the entire room, clearly enjoying his role as both player and instructor. "The key to good chess," Robert said as he moved his bishop to c4, "is thinking ahead. You have to anticipate what your opponent might do and plan accordingly. It's just like business, really. Always stay 3 steps ahead of the competition." Several investors murmured their agreement. The parallel between chess strategy and business strategy was one that resonated with everyone in the room. Robert was in his element, combining his love of chess with his natural talent for holding an audience's attention. Isabella moved her bishop to c5, and Robert smiled broadly. "Now you're getting it." That's called the Italian game opening. Very classical, very solid. He moved his pawn to d3, supporting his center. "See how I'm building a strong foundation?" That's crucial in both chess and business. The game continued with both players developing their pieces in what appeared to be textbook fashion. Robert maintained his running commentary, explaining concepts like castling, pawn structure, and piece coordination. Isabella listened attentively and asked occasional questions that seemed to indicate she was genuinely learning from his explanations. "Can the knight really move in that L shape from anywhere?" she asked when Robert moved his knight from b1 to d2. "Absolutely," Robert replied, pleased by her interest. "Knights are unique that way. 2 squares in one direction, then 1 square perpendicular, or 1 square in one direction, then 2 squares perpendicular, as long as they end up on a different colored square than where they started." Isabella nodded thoughtfully and moved her knight from g8 to f6. It was a natural developing move, but she seemed to study the board carefully before making it, as if she was really thinking through all the implications Robert had explained. "Very nice," Robert said. "You're starting to see how the pieces work together." About 15 minutes into the game, both players had castled their kings to safety and developed most of their pieces. The position looked balanced and unremarkable, exactly what everyone expected from a game between an experienced player and a beginner who was learning as she went. Robert was enjoying himself immensely. He felt like a master craftsman demonstrating his art to an appreciative audience. His moves came quickly and confidently, accompanied by explanations about why each move was strong and what he was trying to accomplish. "Now watch this," Robert said, moving his queen to h5 with a dramatic flourish. "I'm putting pressure on your king side." This is the kind of attacking move that can really put your opponent in trouble if they're not careful. Isabella studied the position for a longer time than she had taken for any previous move. Robert waited patiently, occasionally glancing at his guest to share knowing looks. This was clearly the moment when the game would begin to slip away from her, when the complexity would become too much for a beginner to handle. But then Isabella moved her pawn from h7 to h6, simply defending against the queen's attack. It was a solid, sensible move that neutralized Robert's immediate threat. "Good defensive thinking," Robert said, though he seemed slightly surprised that she had found the correct response so quickly. But defense can only take you so far in chess. Eventually, you have to create some threats of your own. He moved his queen back to d1, regrouping for another attack. The investors had gradually moved closer to the board as the game progressed, some of them becoming genuinely interested in watching the moves unfold. Isabella moved her bishop from c8 to g4, pinning Robert's knight to his queen. It was a tactical move that showed more understanding than anyone had expected from her. Robert looked at the board with slightly more attention than he had been giving it before. The pin was annoying, though easily dealt with. "That's actually quite clever," he admitted. "You're starting to see some tactical possibilities." He moved his bishop to e2, breaking the pin. But as he did, He noticed that Isabella was studying the position with the kind of intense concentration that seemed unusual for someone who was supposedly learning the game as she played. "Your move," Robert said, settling back in his chair. Isabella reached for her queen, paused, then moved it to d6. It was a quiet move that didn't seem to accomplish much, but something about the way she made it caught Robert's attention. There was a certainty to it that hadn't been there in her earlier moves. "Interesting choice," Robert said, though he wasn't entirely sure what she was trying to accomplish with that move. The room was quieter now. The side conversations had gradually died down as more people became interested in watching the game. Even those who didn't know much about chess could sense that something was shifting in the dynamic between the two players. Robert moved his rook to d1, doubling up on the d file. It was a strong positional move that increased the pressure on Isabella's position. But as he made the move, he found himself looking at the board with just a little more care than he had been using before. Something was different. He couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. But Isabella's last few moves had shown a level of understanding that seemed inconsistent with someone who needed basic rules explained to her just 30 minutes earlier. "Your turn," he said, watching her face carefully as she studied the position. Isabella moved her rook from a8 to d8, challenging Robert's rook directly. It was a bold move that showed she wasn't intimidated by the pressure he was trying to create. For the first time since the game began, Robert felt a small flutter of uncertainty. This wasn't how things were supposed to be going. Robert stared at the board longer than he had for any move so far. Isabella's rook on d8 wasn't just challenging his rook. It was occupying a critical file with perfect timing. And suddenly Robert realized that his position wasn't as comfortable as he had assumed. He glanced up at Isabella, who sat quietly with her hands folded, watching him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the game. But now there was something different in her eyes. A sharpness that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had been there all along and he simply hadn't noticed. "Well," Robert said, trying to maintain his confident tone for the benefit of his guests, "looks like you're getting the hang of this pretty quickly." Isabella smiled politely but said nothing. Robert moved his rook to d2, avoiding the direct confrontation. It seemed like the safe choice, maintaining pressure while keeping his pieces protected. But as soon as he lifted his hand from the piece, Isabella responded with knight to d4. The move hit the position like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, Robert's entire setup was under attack. The knight on d4 was striking at multiple targets simultaneously, and Robert found himself calculating variations that he hadn't seen coming. How had she spotted that move so quickly? Robert paused, studying the board with genuine concentration for the first time since the game began. "That's actually quite good." Around the room, the investors had grown quieter. David Kim set down his wine glass and moved closer to the board. Patricia Williams stopped her conversation mid-sentence and focused on the position. Even those who didn't play chess could sense that something unexpected was happening. Robert spent nearly 3 minutes calculating his response. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Isabella was supposed to be learning as she played, making simple moves while he demonstrated superior strategy and technique. Instead, she had just played a move that created genuine problems for his position. He finally moved his bishop to d3, defending against the knight's threats while trying to maintain some initiative. But Isabella's response came almost immediately. Bishop takes bishop, removing one of Robert's key defensive pieces. Robert recaptured with his queen. But the exchange had left his position loosened and his king slightly more exposed. These weren't the kind of subtle positional considerations that a beginner should understand, let alone exploit. "You're full of surprises," Robert said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty for the first time that evening. Isabella moved her queen to h5 and Robert's stomach dropped. The move attacked his h2 pawn and created threats against his king that he hadn't anticipated. Worse, he couldn't immediately see a clean way to defend everything. The room was completely quiet now. All pretense of casual entertainment had vanished. Every person in the study was focused intently on the chessboard, watching as the game took on a complexity and intensity that none of them had expected. Robert's next move took him nearly 5 minutes to find. He pushed his h-pawn to h3, creating an escape square for his king while defending against the immediate threats. But Isabella's response was swift and devastating. Queen to f3. "Oh my," whispered Patricia Williams, even though she barely knew how the pieces moved. The queen on f3 was perfectly placed, controlling crucial squares around Robert's king while maintaining pressure on multiple fronts. Robert was being systematically outmaneuvered by someone who 20 minutes earlier had needed the basic rules explained to her. Robert wiped a thin line of sweat from his forehead. This was beyond embarrassing. This was becoming a genuine struggle for survival. He moved his queen to e2, trying to trade queens and simplify the position, but Isabella calmly moved her queen to h5, maintaining the pressure. "How did you—" Robert began, then stopped himself. He was starting to suspect that Isabella's earlier questions about basic moves had been something other than genuine confusion. Isabella moved her rook from d8 to d4, and Robert saw immediately that his position was becoming critical. The rook and queen were working together with a coordination that spoke of deep understanding, not beginner's luck. David Kim leaned over to another investor and whispered, "Has anyone ever seen her play before?" No one had an answer. Robert's moves were taking longer and longer. What had started as a casual demonstration was now requiring every ounce of his chess knowledge just to stay in the game. Isabella's pieces were dancing around the board with a harmony that made Robert's own moves look clumsy by comparison. Then Isabella played rook to d2. The move was stunning in its simplicity and effectiveness. The rook invaded Robert's second rank, where it could attack multiple targets while supporting the queen's assault on his king. Robert studied the position desperately, looking for some way to coordinate a defense. "This is incredible," David Kim said quietly. "She's systematically dismantling his position." Robert tried knight to e4, attempting to create some counterplay, but Isabella immediately responded with queen to f3 again, and Robert realized that his knight was now trapped. Every move he made seemed to make his position worse. The investors watched in fascination as Isabella's pieces moved with mechanical precision. Each move seemed to improve her position, while simultaneously worsening Robert's difficulties. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no uncertainty. "I don't understand," Patricia Williams murmured. "She's playing like a master," David Kim finished. Robert was down to his last few reasonable moves. Isabella's attack was building inexorably, and he could see that his position was becoming hopeless. But it was the way she was winning that truly shocked him. This wasn't luck or beginner's intuition. This was systematic, strategic destruction of his position by someone who understood chess at a level far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Isabella moved her queen to g3, and Robert's hand froze halfway to his king. The queen on g3 was preparing a mating attack that he couldn't prevent. His pieces were scattered and uncoordinated, while hers worked together like a perfectly tuned orchestra. "I think," Robert said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I may have underestimated you." Isabella looked up from the board for the first time in several moves. Her expression was still calm, still polite, but there was something else there now. A quiet confidence that had been hidden beneath her earlier deference. "The game isn't over yet," she said gently. But everyone in the room could see that it was. Robert's king was surrounded. His pieces were passive, and Isabella's attack was about to crash through with unstoppable force. The only question now was how many moves it would take. Robert moved his king to h1, his last attempt to escape the mating net, but Isabella simply moved her rook to d1, and the sound of the marble piece touching the board seemed to echo in the silent room. "Check," Isabella said quietly. Robert looked at the board, then looked at Isabella, then looked around the room at his guests, who were staring at the position with expressions of amazement and disbelief. For the first time in years, Robert Chen was completely speechless. The cleaning woman who had needed the rules of chess explained to her 30 minutes earlier was about to deliver checkmate to one of the city's most successful businessmen, and everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would change how they thought about assumptions, talent, and the people they encountered every day without really seeing. Isabella waited patiently for Robert's next move, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while the most powerful people in the city watched in stunned silence as their entire understanding of the evening was turned completely upside down. Robert's king had nowhere to go. He moved it to g2, the only legal move available, but everyone in the room could see that it was just delaying the inevitable. Isabella had woven a mating net so tight that escape was impossible. Isabella moved her queen to g4, and the sound of marble against marble seemed unusually loud in the completely silent room. "Checkmate," she said softly. The word hung in the air like smoke. Robert stared at the board for a long moment, tracing the lines of attack with his eyes, searching for some escape he had missed. But there was none. His king was trapped, surrounded by Isabella's pieces working in perfect harmony. Slowly, Robert reached out and tipped over his king in the traditional gesture of resignation. The small marble piece made a tiny clicking sound as it fell against the board. "Well," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was unexpected." The silence in the room was complete. 12 of the most successful business people in the city stood motionless, staring at a chessboard where their host had just been thoroughly defeated by someone they had all overlooked completely. David Kim was the first to speak. "Isabella," he said carefully, "where did you learn to play like that?" Isabella looked around the room at all the faces watching her. For a moment she seemed to consider her words carefully. Then she spoke in the same quiet, respectful tone she had used all evening. "I learned in Colombia," she said. "When I was younger." "Colombia," Patricia Williams repeated. "Did you play in clubs there?" "Something like that," Isabella replied. Robert was still staring at the board, trying to process what had just happened. "But you asked about how the pieces moved," he said. "You seemed like you didn't know the rules." Isabella smiled slightly, the first truly genuine smile she had shown all evening. "I wanted to hear how you explained them. Different people teach chess differently. I was curious about your approach." "My approach," Robert repeated numbly. One of the other investors, a man named Vincent Torres, who had been quiet most of the evening, stepped forward. "Isabella, forgive me, but that wasn't just good chess. That was exceptional chess. That was the kind of chess you only see from serious tournament players." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was ranked third in Colombia when I was 19 years old." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. "Third in the entire country?" David Kim asked. "Yes." "What happened?" Patricia Williams asked gently. "Why aren't you still playing professionally?" Isabella's expression grew more serious. "Life happened. My family needed money. There isn't much money in chess unless you're one of the very best in the world. And I wasn't quite that good. So I came here to work and send money home." Robert finally looked up from the board. "How long have you been here?" 4 years. I came when I was 22. "And you've been cleaning buildings this whole time?" "I clean buildings at night. During the day, I study engineering at the community college. It's a good degree for finding better work eventually." The room was processing this information slowly. Vincent Torres shook his head in amazement. "You're studying engineering and you're a former national chess champion?" "Former number 3, Isabella corrected. "The champion was much better than me." Robert stood up from the chessboard, his legs feeling unsteady. "Isabella, I owe you an enormous apology. I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong." "You didn't know," Isabella said simply. "Most people don't ask about the cleaning lady's chess rating." David Kim laughed, though it was a laugh tinged with embarrassment. "That's certainly true. Isabella, can I ask you something? What kind of engineering are you studying?" "Industrial engineering. I'm particularly interested in process optimization and systems analysis." "Systems analysis," Patricia Williams repeated thoughtfully. "The same kind of thinking you just demonstrated in that chess game." "Chess is all about systems," Isabella agreed. "You have to see how all the pieces work together, how small changes in one area affect everything else. It's very similar to engineering problems." Robert was beginning to understand the full scope of his mistake. "So when you were listening to me explain business strategy through chess analogies..." As the investors gathered around the conference table, Robert noticed how naturally they included Isabella in their conversations. David Kim was asking her opinion about market trends in Southeast Asia. Patricia Williams was discussing the banking implications of their expansion plans. Vincent Torres was sharing updates from his own consulting work. The transformation had been remarkable to watch. Isabella had gone from being invisible to being one of the most respected voices in the room. But more importantly, the people around her had learned to look beyond their initial assumptions and recognize talent wherever it existed. "Before we begin tonight's presentation," Robert said as everyone settled in for dinner, "I want to share something with all of you." The room grew quiet, and all eyes turned to Robert. 3 months ago, we all learned an important lesson in this room. We learned that talent doesn't always come in the packages we expect. We learned that assumptions can blind us to extraordinary possibilities. And we learned that sometimes the most valuable insights come from the people we overlook. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. Isabella has transformed our company in ways I couldn't have imagined. But more than that, she's transformed how we think about finding and developing talent. Because of what we learned that night, we've created opportunities for dozens of other people who might otherwise have been overlooked. Patricia Williams nodded. Our bank has implemented similar programs. We've discovered remarkable talent in unexpected places. Same here, added Vincent Torres. That chess game changed how I evaluate potential employees. I look beyond resumes now. I look for evidence of analytical thinking, regardless of where it comes from. David Kim smiled. I've started carrying a pocket chess set to interviews, not to test chess skills, but to see how people approach complex problems. It's been incredibly revealing. Isabella listened to the conversation with a mixture of pride and humility. I never expected that one chess game would lead to all of this, she said. Neither did I, Robert admitted. But that's the thing about assumptions. When we let go of them, we create space for amazing things to happen. He raised his glass. To Isabella, for teaching us that excellence can be found anywhere, if we're wise enough to recognize it. The group raised their glasses in agreement. And to all of you, Isabella added, for being willing to change your minds when presented with new information. That's not as common as it should be. As dinner progressed and Isabella presented her analysis of the Bangkok expansion, Robert reflected on how much his perspective had changed. He thought about all the people he encountered every day: security guards, restaurant servers, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, and wondered what hidden talents and dreams they carried. The chess game had ended in checkmate, but it had started something much larger. It had opened their eyes to the possibility that extraordinary people were all around them, often doing ordinary jobs while carrying extraordinary potential. After the meeting ended and the guests had left, Robert and Isabella found themselves alone in the study once again. The chess set sat on its table, the pieces arranged and ready for another game. Up for a rematch? Robert asked. Isabella smiled. Are you sure you want to go through that again? Actually, I was hoping you might teach me something this time, instead of the other way around. Isabella considered this. What would you like to learn? How to see the possibilities I've been missing. In chess and in everything else? Isabella moved to the chessboard and began setting up the pieces. The first lesson is simple, she said. Every piece on the board has value, even the ones that seem least important. The key is understanding how to use each piece to its full potential, including pawns, especially pawns. People underestimate pawns because they seem weak and limited. But a pawn that reaches the other end of the board can become the most powerful piece in the game. Robert nodded, understanding that they weren't just talking about chess anymore. The second lesson, Isabella continued, is that position matters more than power. A well-placed pawn can be more valuable than a poorly positioned queen. She finished arranging the pieces and looked up at Robert. And the most important lesson of all, never assume you know what your opponent is capable of until they've shown you. Because the moment you stop paying attention, the moment you think you have everything figured out, that's when you're most likely to be surprised. Robert sat down at the board, but this time he was the student and Isabella was the teacher. As she began explaining strategy and tactics with the same patience he had once shown her, Robert realized that the real lesson of that first chess game had nothing to do with chess at all. It was about the extraordinary people who surround us every day, waiting for someone to see their true potential and give them a chance to shine. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, all it takes is one game to change everything.